collapse of coastal regions, crumbling coastal regions is coastlines is a real thing, and it's happening today already.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Climate Emergency Forum. Today, we'll be discussing what global warming has in store for us, especially those of us living in cities and states near the coastline. Our topic today, crumbling coastlines in crisis. And I'm going to give you just a brief overview, just a snapshot, if you will, of certain parts of the United States that are already facing dire consequences of global climate change. So I'm going to talk to you about sea level rise and the levels that we've seen of increase since 1950. So in the west coast of the United States, we have a sea level rise of 3 inches. That's 3 inches since 1950. And in San Francisco in particular, which is home of the port of San Francisco, there's been a rise of actually 6 inches. Now, this is costing over $6 billion in terms of future mitigation. And the sea level rise that we're seeing here is due to ice melting into the ocean and thermal expansion. And of course, thermal expansion means that when the water gets warmer, it expands. So it's a two-part thing happening there in that particular region. And then we have South Florida. So South Florida has seen an increase of 8 inches since 1950. And this is due to, again, ice melting into the ocean. And rather surprising, a lot of South Florida rests on porous limestone. And so that's also problematic. And they're planning over they're planning over $4 billion in future mitigation for the sea level rise that they'll be facing. Next on the list is South Carolina. South Carolina has 10 inches of sea level rise. That's almost a foot. 10 inches of sea level rise since 1950. And this is home of the Port of Charleston. And that's, of course, in Charleston, South Carolina. Their sea level rise that they're experiencing is mostly due to ice melt, and they're planning over $2 billion for future mitigation costs. Then we're going to move over to the East Coast. The East Coast of the nation has seen 14 inches, over a foot, 14 inches of sea level rise since 1950. Then we zero in specifically to New York City. And New York City has seen 9 inches in sea level rise. And of course, the New York area is home to 2 very, very busy ports. That's the port of New Jersey and New York. And the sea level rise that this region is experiencing is mostly due to subsidence, land sinking, and also the slowing of the Gulf Stream. And I can't speak to that, but I'm hoping that maybe Paul will explain to us what the slowing Gulf Stream has to do with sea level rise. Should be interesting. Now, I want to finish off this list with our winner, our dubious winner, shall I say, or not dubious, it certainly leads the pack in the nation, and that is the Gulf Coast region. The Gulf Coast region has seen over 18 inches, a foot and a half of sea level rise since 1950. Now, Texas has seen an increase of 1 inch a year, sea level rise. Their sea level rise is mostly due to subsidence, once again, the sinking of the land, and they're pumping out a tremendous amount of groundwater. That's leading to land sinking. And so we see that we have ports in this region, in the Gulf region, ports of Houston and ports of Louisiana, which are also very important ports because they're right at the near the Mississippi River. And that, of course, cuts all the way through the country up to Canada. And they're planning over 12 billion in mitigation costs. What is also really frightening about the Gulf Coast, it's not just the ports that'll be affected, but please bear in mind, there's a tremendous amount of refineries. Texas City alone, it's this entire vast city that's just got piles of refinery. Well, what happens when these fuel refineries meet flooding waters? I can't give you the specifics, but I can guarantee you it's frightening. And it's something that we're going to have to consider. I may be speaking later on, if I have a chance, to some of the cities in particular that are facing sea level rise and the dangers that they will encounter. But I want to draw your attention to an excellent article that the New York Times had just a few days ago about the city of Chicago and what's happening to that city due to sea level rise and their coastal erosion. And we're going to go ahead and put a link to that fantastic article down in the comments. And I really hope that you guys will click on that. There's a lot to learn from that article. And I mentioned sea ice melt, and I'm hoping that Dr. Peter Carter can fill us in on what that means for these regions and more across the world.
Wow, Regina, that's way more than an introduction. That's the best presentation I've ever heard on the issue of sea level rise and coasts. That was riveting. Thank you. So I'll go straight on and say that, of course, sea level rise is accelerating. As you indicate, now it's accelerating faster because the Greenland ice sheets and the Antarctic ice sheets are losing mass at an accelerating rate also. And so things that you have already described in such great detail are going to get rapidly, rapidly worse. And we cannot avoid that with the amount of heat that's locked into the climate system and the heat that's locked into the oceans. We can't avoid those things. And they're going to be, as you've already indicated, massively expensive and huge undertakings. A recent paper has done some data which shows that the Greenland ice sheet and Antarctic ice sheet melting is, in fact, following worst case scenario, and that worst case scenario applies to sea level rise. So we've been talking for years and years about the fear of multi-meter sea level rise flooding our coastal cities, but I've never heard that explained in such riveting detail as you just did. However, it's nothing, none of these terrible impacts are in isolation. They're all occurring and will continue to occur increasingly disastrously together. I want to mention a hugely important media coverage about a week ago of a leak of the IPCC Sixth Assessment. And in the media, I guess they were anxious to get this leak because the next big climate conference, the COP26 coming up at the end of the year, will not have the benefit of the Sixth Assessment reporting because the Sixth Assessment doesn't come out until the following year. So this is tremendous and it is dramatic and frankly pretty scary information. So here's what the media reported, just one section. Climate change will fundamentally reshape life on Earth in the coming decades, even if humans can tame their planet-warming greenhouse gas emissions. And that's a landmark draft report from the UN's climate advisors. So we have species extinction, more widespread diseases, unlivable heat, ecosystem collapse, cities menaced by rising seas. These and other devastating climate impacts are accelerating. This is from the IPCC, folks. This is from the Conservative Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. These will become painfully obvious, all of them, before a child born today turns 30. The choices societies make now will determine whether our species thrives or simply survives as the 21st century unfolds. The IPCC says in their draft report. But dangerous thresholds are closer than once thought. and dire consequences stemming from decades of unbridled carbon pollution are unavoidable in the short term. The last sentence on this section I want to read to you: the worst is yet to come, affecting our children's and grandchildren's lives far more than our own are being affected anywhere, the report says. So a vision of crumbling coastlines, the first thing that comes to my head, my vision is up in the Arctic, the permafrost. Because I remember a few years ago, a study by Katie Walter-Anthony, who's done so much great work, researcher up in the Arctic, that her team went up to find out how much methane was being released as the permafrost crumpled. These vast cliffs of permafrost crumpled into the sea. It was huge. It was 12 times more than the carbon that had been estimated to be released rapidly as these permafrost coastlines crumbled. A last mention, biodiversity, the sixth extinction. The sixth extinction is everywhere. And in our regions, the sixth extinction is largely on our coastlines, in our estuaries, in our wetlands near the coast. And they, of course, are being devastated increasingly by saltwater intrusion and erosion from the very rapid increase in sea level rise, as you made very clear, Regina. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, that's very, very scary news. Thank you for sharing with us the information from the IPCC leak. The fact that we're moving on the worst case scenario, well, it's incredibly difficult to hear. And I just want to make sure I heard you right. So you're saying even if humans, which is not going to happen, but even if humans stopped all carbon emitting activities, we are still going to have devastating impacts?
Actually, the NOAA last year did an article on this and said that actually, if we stop all our emissions, the global surface heating will slow down, but it won't stop. It'll carry on for quite some time. And when we get that global heating, that global temperature increase, it's going to last for thousands of years. So this is why the IPCC are so right to say that there are many disastrous impacts which cannot now be avoided. And they will get worse to a degree. So what we have to do and what we can do now is get our global emissions into rapid decline so that we can truly mitigate, so that we can truly actually damp down some of these global disasters that we are now committed to, that are now going to happen.
Well, it's hard for me to say thank you for that, but thank you for that, Dr. Carter. Paul, I'm interested to hear what you have to say, and I'm especially hopeful that you might bring up the Gulf
Ocean
Stream,
currents.
Yeah, the ocean currents,
Right.
as they're playing a role.
Yes, there's numerous factors, some kind of obscure that people don't think about in terms of causes of sea level rise. So the most obvious, as you've said, is the heating, the thermal effect. When you heat a substance, any substance, it expands because the molecules move faster and it pushes the material apart, so it occupies more volume. So most of the sea level rise up to now has been from thermal expansion of the seawater at the surface, but the ocean is heating all the way down to great depths. So that's adding to all of the expansion, and with a larger volume of water, it's going to overflow the basins and affect the coastlines. Subsidence or subsidence, you mentioned, and of course that's happening whenever you build a huge city on the water. The weight of the buildings itself pushes down the land. Many cities are built in river deltas, and the silt and sediments from the river build up in the delta, and that added weight pushes them down. The opposite effect is the uplifting of the land, which is going on in areas where the ice on land is melting, and that's less weight on the surface of the land, and the land is rising up. So that's occurring in parts of the Arctic, especially, and There's also a gravity effect where you have, when you think of, any mass will attract any other mass to it. There's a universal gravitation law determining the size of that effect. And when we melt huge amounts of glacial ice in Greenland and Antarctica, the pull on the ocean water around is decreasing because the mass is decreasing of the ice. So that the ocean can actually move away from those regions, and that fooled scientists for a number of decades ago when it seemed that the sea level rise was much less around Greenland and Antarctica. And of course, the ocean, the temperature distribution change on the planet. So the huge warming of the Arctic relative to the rest of the planet is lowering the temperature difference to the equator. So that affects not only the atmosphere, the jet streams become slower and wavier, but also the ocean currents slow down. So how that is manifested is the Gulf Stream, for example, is slowing down. And when it slows down, it overrides the east coast of the US more and causes additional sea level rise. So that's why some of the sea level rise in some areas of the US coast is larger than just about any other region in the world. Another huge effect of the lack of sea ice in the Arctic, sea ice itself, floating ice, when that melts, that doesn't cause sea level rise. It's the ice on the land that does that. But the lack of sea ice, ocean ice, means that there's more open water. So therefore wave action can get much, much larger in the Arctic. And that additional wave action is causing more corrosion or erosion rather of the coastlines. And there's a lot of permafrost in those coastlines. So that permafrost is thawing. The water embedded within is melting, and it's losing its structural integrity. So we're getting a lot of collapses of coastlines right into the ocean, right? So the coastline is receding. So all of these effects are bad. Now, in the case of Florida, if you wonder so what will happen in coastlines like Florida, for example, with rising sea level? Will people just start moving away when their streets are flooded and so on? I think we've got a glimpse of what will happen, and that is collapsing buildings on the coastlines, because the condo that collapsed recently, may have had defective concrete materials. The concrete was eroded by the salt. Salt got into the concrete and started corroding away the rebar, so the materials weren't great in those buildings. But Florida is basically built on limestone, and water can cut holes through the limestone like Swiss cheese. So there's no way you can build a seawall, for example, to stop the water getting in. It just goes underneath, and it's undercutting. Imagine turning the solid rock base underneath your buildings, and imagine that solid rock turning into Swiss cheese, perforated by holes, and that's what's happening in Florida. And that building that collapsed was sinking something like 2 millimeters a year over the decade from in the 90s, and who knows how quickly that accelerated in the 2000s and the 2010s. And as a result, the building collapsed. So this is what we're going to see in Florida. People will be much more reluctant to live in a high rise in coastal regions of Florida, because the coastal buildings are literally crumbling as the coastline crumbles away as well.
That's fascinating, Paul, and thank you so much. I didn't understand the role of limestone in Florida and the role of limestone in destabilizing the shorelines. But what you say makes perfect sense, and I understand it much more now. So I really appreciate that. The whole idea of sinking land, it just goes to show you the best plans, they say, of mice and men, right? We try to make things better, and by doing so, we make things worse. And I mentioned Chicago, a great city here in the United States. But how did Chicago form? Well, it was once swampland. And what did the individuals do? They filled up that swampland and they began making the city called Chicago. And the same thing happened in New Orleans, also built on a swamp, also sinking precipitously. And as a matter of fact, it's one of the most vulnerable cities in the United States in terms of climate change. And this is due to first of all, it already had a low elevation and it's sinking, as I mentioned, because it's a swamp. And the sea level is rising and the hurricanes are predicted to get much worse, much worse. So it's truly frightening. Predictions are 1 to 4.6 feet of sea level rise by 2100, but I'd like to say that's based on a 2009 model. So as far as I'm concerned, we can go ahead and throw that one out, especially in light of what Dr. Carter just shared with us in terms of the most recent IPCC report. And Dr. Carter, your thoughts?
Well, on sea level rise and, policy and consideration of climate change, this is the long term. I mean, we are condemning future generations, for hundreds of years to a harsh, horrid life. As the IPCC says, the recent report leak says, if we don't get global emissions into decline like now, we are, and some people are more responsible than others, obviously, particularly the ones that are me included, the first few percent who live in a more advantaged situation, et cetera, because the IPCC did stress that the billions of vulnerable people were going to be severely impacted. But sea level rise goes on for many centuries. The coastal erosions on the vulnerable coastal regions, and of course the low-lying islands, it's going to be way worse because of some recent research that just came out this year. So what's happening with an increase in surface temperature of the oceans and an increase in energy in the lower atmosphere in the air around? Well, now they found that the waves are getting bigger and they're getting stronger. And so that will continue to increase. So these communities and these low-lying islands, right, they're not just going to suffer sea level rise and intrusion into the agricultural regions, et cetera. They are going to experience, and I mean, we've seen some already, on the news and the documentaries. They're going to be pummeled by these supercharged waves due to global surface warming over the oceans.
Thank you, Peter. The size of the waves getting bigger and stronger is something I'd certainly never considered, and I can see how that would play a tremendous role of erosion of our cities and of the earth itself. Paul?
Yes, the size of waves, over any body of water depends on, of course, the speed of the wind, but also the duration of the wind blowing over that surface, and also the distance or so-called fetch over the water surface. So, the Arctic particularly has not really experienced large waves in the past because of the sea ice covering. But now that the sea ice covering is rapidly retreating, there's large expanses of open water year-round on some of the coastlines, or at least for longer durations of the year. And that's really means, the wave's height there has gone up, has notched up. I call it exponentially or call it abruptly. It's just low level waves before and now huge waves, and it's really doing a number on the coastlines. The other thing with sea level rise is, you mentioned the Caribbean islands, and Caribbean islands, most of them don't have any source of fresh water other than there's a freshwater lens generally. That fresh water is lighter than salt water. So the ocean is going into the bedrock and limestone underneath the islands, and the fresh water that is there is kind of like, imagine a lens on top of the seawater that is next to the surface, so they could drill down a little bit and get fresh water just below the ground and on some of those islands. But as sea level rises, that lens gets squeezed out, gets pushed out, and eventually disappears. So there's no source of fresh water suddenly on these islands. That's a huge problem. Also, there are a lot of nasty things that we've built on coastlines. There's one nuclear reactor in Florida that is built on a sandbar, believe it or not. And, we were worried a few years ago when a hurricane was coming through that it could take out that entire sandbar and reactor. in California, there's a nuclear waste dump in one bay, and they buried the nuclear waste in large metal canisters and barrels and things, and those barrels are, with the crumbling higher erosion and sea level rise on the Pacific coast, some of those barrels are actually visible, they're exposed, and they're going to have to spend enormous amounts of money to remove them, or or they'll probably try to shore up the coastline at first, and then they'll give up on that, and they'll eventually have to move all that nuclear waste away. During the Cold War and before the Cold War, there were lots of nuclear tests on Pacific atolls and things, and some of the nuclear waste was buried on some of the islands there in these large canisters, which are now being completely submerged by seawater rise. The Russians put lots of their nuclear waste on Arctic islands, Novaya Zemlya and other islands. They took their nuclear subs and emptied them out and basically sank them off those islands in the water. That was an icebound world before, and it is no longer. So there's huge concerns of the nuclear waste coming out of those. And the Russians actually tested the largest H-bomb in history, which they call Tsar Bomba, T-S-A-R, Tsar Bomba. Just look at the wiki page for that if you want to get some interesting or frightening sort of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde type history, up in the Arctic. So, we build a lot of nasty things, but I think the people in Florida buying condos on the coast, Miami Beach and other places, they thought that, there's some days when the water level is just so high because of king tides. They call it sunny day flooding. The streets flood and people are inconvenienced. And, these people living in the condos, that are inconvenienced on the coastlines now realize that their condo could just collapse, right? This is a new thing for them, which they never thought of before. So, that will start to have huge ramifications on the demand for such places in Florida, and another few condo collapses, unexpected, in quotes, condo collapses, and people might move away in droves from Florida and those low-lying areas. So collapse of coastal regions, crumbling coastal regions is coastlines is a real thing, and it's happening today already.
Well, I tell you, Paul, as a New Yorker, I've spent many a winter here kind of looking wistfully at ads for Miami Beach condos and thinking, gee, if I could only have one of those. And I got to tell you, you cured me of that.
Well, come up to Canada instead, I mean, you guys just got a lot of your subways flooded out again, and that was just from remnants of a tropical storm, and a few feet of rain in a day or two, right, in New York.
That's right.
That reminds people of Sandy, probably, right?
That's right.
Because these storms, like Sandy and all these other tropical storms, I mean, they're going to have enormously lot more impact on coastlines when they're on top of sea level rise and king tides, for example, and subsidence of coastlines and all these other factors.
Right, and you are correct. I've seen the videos of water pouring down the stairs into the subway system, and mind you, the subway has a third rail. It's the third rail. It's fully electric. And I've heard that water and electricity don't mix. So, this is tough. This is one of those discussions where I almost feel like we have to offer some type of words for our viewers, but we have to tell it like it is. And
well, change your light bulbs, right?
Change your light bulb.
I mean, that's what we we could do a lot better than that, obviously, but that was sort of the solution touted for many years. And speaking of the New York subway flooding, somebody always posts the obligatory photo on Twitter of the subway flooding with a shark photoshopped into the picture, right? So that's a given that will happen.
Well, you got to find the humor somewhere, don't you? It's kind of important with all of this really bad news. So I'm grateful for that. But I have to say it's something that Peter said in the beginning. It's like these co-occurring disasters. And so there it is, folks. We're offering it up to you right here, right now. Look forward to a lot of these co-occurring disasters. What can I say? It's only the truth. These things we have these things called feedback loops, and even some of the greatest scientists can't predict things because these feedback loops simply enhance the actions that climate change will have in our lives. And we want you to know these truths. And so we encourage you to keep coming back, even if it's difficult. Please do pay attention to these links that we're going to be offering you down in the description. And also, we really want to hear your comments. What are your thoughts? Do you own a condo in Florida? Are you worried? Are you not worried? Are you going to go ahead and buy one anyway? Well, we'd like to hear about that as well. Are you on one of these small island nations out in the Caribbean somewhere? We'd like to hear from you as well. And as always, thank you all for joining us for yet another Climate Emergency Forum.